Well, hi there, U.S. history students. Welcome in. I'm excited for what we're going to be learning about today. This is lesson 9.5 about the climactic moments in the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. So yeah, our targets for the day, I can describe the civil rights movement. You can describe how they operated. We can describe the resistance that they faced and the successes that they had. All right. I can assess the success of the movement and of Dr. King's vision. So this involves making a judgment, a value judgment. To what extent was it successful? To what extent was it not successful? And then we're always considering the question of the good life in America. This will be the backdrop for today. But one of the reasons why today's lesson is so big is that so many threads in our whole course point to some of the stuff we're going to learn at today, right? Everything we learned about some of the beauty of America's ideals and the core values at the center of who we are. So many of the stories of justice or of injustice that we've looked at are going to be sort of being addressed and spoken to in this. And so, what a moment. Let's return to my deep hope for students in this class. I mean, if this does not resonate with today's lesson, then it's probably just not going to ever resonate in this whole course for you. But may we see God's story in the blessings and the curses of our American inheritance. And beyond that, may we desire to be a part of His restorative plan. It's my hope that as we listen to stuff like this, and we see the fall, we see people aiming at creation, and we see restoration work in effect, that we recognize and we feel the stirring in our own hearts, and that our lives can speak into that. It's one of the joys of my profession to get to see how high school students respond to this when they really understand it in all its complexity. Let's begin and let's frame today with a thought, an opening meditation from Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. The Christian owes his ultimate allegiance to God. And if any earthly institution conflicts with God's will, it is your Christian duty to take a stand against it. May I just say a word to those of you who are struggling with this evil of racism and segregation. Always be sure that you struggle with Christian methods and Christian weapons. Never succumb to the temptation of becoming bitter. As you press on for justice, be sure to move with dignity and discipline, using only the weapon of love. Let no man pull you so low as to hate him. Always avoid violence. We'll begin there with that meditation. And I want to be careful, again, that we don't treat, I don't want to treat Dr. King as Santa Claus, like I said in the last lesson. He was a real human being with moral failings, right? I wish he had made different decisions with women in his life, for example. I think that would have, I think it tarnished his legacy somewhat that he had some of these sin areas, all right? Yet, like we do with every other human being in our course, let's make a pro bucket in the legacy bin and a con bucket, all right? The good and the bad. And I will drop some stuff in the negative here in the sin area, just like we all have, and then I'll say, but man, oh man, the stuff that he added to the American story and your American inheritance is some beautiful stuff. All right? It's okay to hold both those things in our hands. So let's proceed with that. Let's pick up our story. 1955. Dr. King is a rising voice in the movement. And the first major victory happens in this sort of extended episode called the Montgomery Bus Boycott. Right? In Montgomery, Alabama, a bit of nonviolent resistance that really catches fire, and it starts with a single act of protest. Right? The famous story of Rosa Parks, right? Who is, what is she, like 37, 38 years old? African-American woman who refuses to give up her seat on the bus when the city ordinance is that the bus is full, so the black passengers have to stand. She refuses to do so. This wasn't just a spontaneous thing that happened that day and that she just sort of felt like it. And it wasn't a thing of like she was an old lady who just needed to rest her weary feet. No, she was a young person. And this was a planned act of protest. She was arrested for violating Jim Crow segregation laws that sort of like mandated in Montgomery how black and white passengers had to interact on a bus like this. You see her being booked in jail. But boy, this catches some media interest, this catches some fire, and African-American leaders, including Dr. King and black church leaders, say, we got something here, this is big, this is interesting. And so what they say is, we want to put pressure on the city of Montgomery to change these segregation codes, these Jim Crow laws related to busing segregation. And here's how we're going to apply that pressure. Through our voice and with our dollar bills. We are not going to ride the city bus. All right? African Americans made up 75% of the busing customers for the city busing system. And so black leaders say to African Americans and to white allies who want to join them, don't ride the bus. So a boycott is, of course, an excellent example of nonviolent resistance. You're letting your voice be heard. You are speaking out. You're doing it nonviolently. You're just saying, we don't want to pay the money for this. This boycott lasts for over a year. During that time, by the way, the bus company is saying to the city of Montgomery, Alabama, get rid of these segregation laws. The bus company doesn't like it either, right? The bus company's like, it's just more laws and government regulations for us to follow. And so finally, after a year, the city relents. They integrate the busing system. And for the civil rights movement, they're just kind of like, look at this, wow. And all of a sudden, like, the word goes out, like, we've got something here. This type of nonviolent resistance is replicated in cities all across the South, and it's being encouraged again by Dr. King and the NAACP and church leaders. This is not something that like government leaders are doing, right? This is grassroots. It's from the bottom up. It's from the churches more than any other organization or institution. It's happening from the churches up. And so there are boycotts like this, or things like going to restaurants or lunch counters. We don't have lunch counters really anymore, but it's like a lunch counter is a place like it would be in a store, or it'd be like a little small cafe where you sit at the counter and you can order, a BLT sandwich and have your lunch served to you. And these counters were segregated. Most of the time they're segregated by local city ordinances or state laws. Sometimes they were segregated by company policies. So what you do at a sit-in is you just go and you're a black person and you sit down and you sit down at a segregated lunch counter and you say, can I have a cup of coffee? That's it. That's your protest. They're probably going to ignore you, right? They might say, can't serve you here, right? They might tell you to get lost. They might say something worse than that. Your job is to sit there and say, I just want an egg salad sandwich. All right, I want a cup of coffee. Maybe you're there with a white ally. People are going to notice, right? People might gather. People might start saying stuff. They might start intimidating you like you're seeing in these images here. All you're doing is you're sitting down at a counter. By doing this, of course, if you're black, you're breaking the law. You are violating the law. And Dr. King would say, like in that first thing, if there is a conflict between a city ordinance in Montgomery, Alabama, and God's law, you go with God's law. And for so many Christians, and this is sort of who King was talking to in that letter you read, so many Christians are like, but you're causing commotion and disruption and conflict and discord. And King would say, yes, in the pursuit of justice, right? Your job as Christians, ladies and gentlemen, is not to obey the police every single time or be good little boys and girls who always follow the rules. Sometimes your job might be, God might put you in the position of being like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego or Daniel and doing the opposite of that. And so King is saying we're in pursuit of justice, we violate unjust laws. Maybe it's not at a lunch counter, maybe it's at a swimming pool. We're black, we're going to go into a pool or a lake that's been sort of segregated. Or we go into a library and I ask if I can have a library card. I ask if I can check out a book. And I violate ordinances or laws by doing this. And you know what might happen eventually? It might get tense enough. Someone might attack us. And if they attack us, we let them attack us. If they pour salt and ketchup and sugar all over our heads, we quietly let them do this. If they arrest us, we allow them to arrest us. We don't resist arrest. But you know what's going to happen, ladies and gentlemen? Newspaper reporters are going to be there. They're going to snap pictures like this. TV cameras might show up. They're going to be getting footage of this. This is going to get shown. when it's on the news, when it's in the newspapers, in our community, or maybe outside our community, people are going to watch this and their hearts will be stirred and their own consciences will be touched. And on some level, they're going to look at this and say, what are these segregation laws about? Who's right and who's wrong on this? What are we doing? And Dr. King says, this whole thing is intended, we're doing it for an audience of people who need to have their eyes opened to the reality of a situation. And this will open people's eyes. And once enough of the country has their eyes open, we trust that they are good enough that they'll say, it's time to change it. But to do that, we got to go through this stage of commotion and disruption. There was a whole heck of a lot of opposition, right? From Southerners or opponents of the civil rights movement, primarily whites. And look, some of it is really violent. A lot of it is over the top, awful racist. A lot of the rhetoric from Southerners was like, look, we just don't like that sometimes people from outside our community are coming in here and causing this commotion, right? Or that the federal government in Brown v. Board, the Supreme Court reached into our schools and our communities and is tinkering with stuff and changing it. We don't like these outsiders or these interlopers. Now, bear in mind, of course, that doesn't address the central question of the justice or injustice of Jim Crow segregation. That's trying to change the topic. And so this is going to be disruptive and disturbing, I suppose, to many people. This is going to involve finding a new way of thinking about things, or maybe on some level acknowledging that you have been wrong, or your dad was wrong, or your mom was wrong, or your grandma or grandpa was wrong on something, right? There's like a disequilibrium that's created there. Some states, they said, okay, federal government says we need to end segregation in schools, and fine, we'll go along with this. But you know what we're also going to do? We're going to put a Confederate flag on our state flag. Or some places say, we're going to start flying a Confederate flag outside our state capitol. Now, what does one thing have to do with the other? Well, that's saying, look, we'll comply with the law, but here's a big middle finger to the federal government and what we think of it, right? This doesn't have to do with honoring the legacy of the Confederate States of America, whatever that is in there that's worth honoring. This has to do with saying, forget you or F you, we don't want to comply with what's going on in the civil rights movement. Let's flash forward 5 or 6 years, right? This nonviolent resistance has been happening more than fits and starts, right? But it's happening in pockets and changes are happening, and we don't have time today to get into all of them. In summer 1963, the civil rights movement leaders and Dr. King pinpoint Birmingham, Alabama as a place that they are going to use or make the epicenter of these protests. And you might, letter from a Birmingham jail is written there in the summer of 1963, right? So, and this because Birmingham had this reputation under the sheriff that was in charge there, Bull Connor, that it had this reputation as the most segregated city in the South. And so we are going to go to that city for nonviolent resistance, peaceful protests, sit-ins, wait-ins, read-ins, all this kind of stuff. All right, they go there. They get permission from the police to sort of legally demonstrate. I forgot, for a day or two, and then they announce, well, we're not leaving after a day or two. We are going to stay. Our disruptions are going to continue. Right, we're going to keep doing this to keep bringing attention to the injustice of the system. And at that point, the police overreact. The police sick dogs on the protesters. They open fire hoses on the protesters. And this isn't like when you're a kid playing out in the sprinkler. All right, a fire hose can take your skin off. And a lot of the protesters were students your age or younger. The image that you're looking at, the top image here, those are students out there. This newsreel footage of the police going after the demonstrators becomes something that it really goes viral. A great many Americans in the North and many increasingly in the South are saying, this is ridiculous. That same summer, there is this event called the March on Washington, which is, again, a very planned, coordinated march. Like, I want to be clear, this isn't all just sort of spontaneously happening necessarily. Civil rights leaders are are recognizing that the wind is at their backs now, right? They have some full sails here and some momentum, and they're trying to capitalize because they're really hoping to get federal legislation passed from Washington, D.C. that goes after segregation in all the states. Some 200,000 people attend. It takes place on the National Mall, which is just outside the Lincoln Memorial. And it's a positive agenda. It's a peaceful agenda. And it's highlighted. It's all on television. And so it's people speaking about civil rights, but it's not ranting and raving, all right? It's like there's a lot of songs and it's positivity, and it's capped off, of course, by Dr. King comes in, and he knows this is his moment. He knows it, like he has the whole nation sitting there, and like, you know, like a great batter in baseball, he steps up to the plate and he just crushes it, right? This is the stage for his I Have a Dream speech, but of course his speech is a perfect synthesis of a Christian message, a gospel message, and a message pointed to the ideals of the founders. And it is an appeal that works. There's action in Washington, D.C. And it was not easy. I want to be clear. It's not like you just give enough speeches and suddenly Washington moves. But enough of the public was moving with this that Lyndon Johnson, the president, sort of pulls enough levers and pushes enough buttons and twists enough arms where eventually you do get passage of this landmark law. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, what does it do? It bans segregation in public accommodations and gives the federal government more power to intervene if states failed to comply. All right? So in any accommodations that are government run, it bans segregation in those. Private facilities cannot segregate as well. And the federal government, if it's like, and the state government of Alabama won't step in, or the Montgomery government's not going to step in, then the federal government will step in on this one. It is effectively the end of Jim Crow segregation. Glory, hallelujah. It's followed up the next year. The Voting Rights Act of 1865 and the 24th Amendment. The 24th Amendment bans poll taxes. The Voting Rights Act of 1865 bans things like literacy tests and stuff like this. And so what that means is now African Americans, all the restrictions that had been there preventing them from voting, all those restrictions and all that sort of barbed wire stuff is being cleared out, and now African Americans can vote as easily as anyone else can vote. Now having a two-term black president is old news. This is not something that's like shocking to us now. Much of that was made possible because of the victories of the civil rights movement. And what I would argue is the victory of the civil rights movement is that it took the American core promise and finally made it open and available to everybody. Does this all have a happy ending though? No. No. Happy endings are funny. How much of a happy ending do we get on anything this side of heaven, right? I'd say you're in 11th grade. It's complicated. The civil rights movement in the mid-60s, after the massive achievements of 1964 and 65, begins to fracture, break apart, become less idealistic, right? You have Dr. King and his colorblind vision that is rooted in American core ideals and the American idea, but there's increasingly people who are moving in a more kind of a black nationalist direction, right? That see a person's race as the basis for their identity, their race as the basis for meaning. And when race is the basis for identity and meaning, then what does that mean for people who are black and people who are white? How much reconciliation, how much restorative work can ultimately happen if we are like permanently different? And the black nationalist direction becomes more uncompromising, right? And it's certainly less rooted in the basic ideals of like we can all participate in Americanness. In a sense, it's like, no, like blackness or whiteness is the thing that I am and can be and rooted in. And I would argue that seeing the root of your identity as blackness or whiteness is equally toxic. And we see certain elements of this movement moving in a more violent direction. You know, there's like the Watts riots in Los Angeles. You see pictured here. There were terrible riots, race riots in Detroit by the mid-1960s. Things are flying off in a different direction in some places. The sad and awful part of the story is, of course, in 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated. He's assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee, outside of his hotel room. assassinated by a white supremacist named James Earl Ray. He was only 39 years old, King was. Safe to say he had a lot more gas in the tank. I mean, the last couple years of his life had been a little bit more frustrated as he's watching this movement sort of fray and fracture a little bit. And today he's really as celebrated as probably any American figure. I mean, maybe short of George Washington or Abraham Lincoln, or maybe not, I don't know. I hope that through this and considering this, you have been helped to see and are learning to see God's story in the blessings and curses of your American inheritance, which includes the story of the Civil Rights Movement. And the Civil Rights Movement includes blessings and some curses. Good restoration work happened there. But then, like we see in this pattern, things decay, right? Things fall away from as they're intended to. But that doesn't mean we stop, right? We're the little kids shoveling the driveway with Dad. Dad helps, God scoops us back up when we say, okay, back at it. That is where I'll leave you today. All right, God bless you guys. Have a great, great Tuesday or Wednesday, and we will talk soon.